As Muslims in the United States face an increasingly oppressive atmosphere, Islamophobic organisations are becoming ever more organised and influential. A new Al Jazeera investigation has found out this. I'm Femi Oke.
And I'm Malika Bilal. You're in the stream live on Al Jazeera and YouTube. Today we'll discuss the documentary and a look at how anti-Muslim groups are making a lucrative business from hate. Have a look.
Intolerance and anger have gripped parts of white America.
Get back right now! You'll be the first one to get murdered by the Muslim!
Assaults on Muslim Americans are increasing.
Your prophet is perverted!
An explosion at a Bloomington Islamic Center.
Send them back to the dustbin they come from and let them go sit on a camel.
Trying to impose the Sharia.
This investigation traces the groups that promote Islamophobia, the fear of Muslims.
Women raped on the streets of Germany because of unvetted Islamic refugees.
We expose the tactics used to influence social media, and we reveal their connections to members of the Trump administration.
I was speaking 3 or 4 times a week with Jeff Sessions, up to the election and after the election.
Islamophobia is now Islamophobia Incorporated, and that's according to our colleagues in Al Jazeera's investigations unit. Leading hate groups across the US are using social media to amplify their bigotry with devastating consequences for Muslim communities. And they have deep pockets thanks to payments from anonymous donors that run into millions of dollars.
Belying the notion that merely individuals and small groups are behind anti-Muslim rhetoric and violence, Islamophobia Incorporated is well-oiled and media-savvy, and it has forged connections with the Trump administration. Here to discuss this, we have Jeremy Young, Al Jazeera's senior investigative producer who worked on the film. Deidre Aboud joins us from Phoenix, Arizona. She is a Democratic candidate for U.S. Senate and founder of the Global Institute of Solution-Oriented Leadership. She appears in the Al Jazeera film we're discussing today.
From Philadelphia, we have Nazia Kazi. She is assistant professor of anthropology at Stockton University and author of the upcoming book, Race, Islamophobia and Global Politics. And in Chicago, we have Ahmed Rehab. He is executive director of the Chicago office of the Council on American Islamic Relations, also known as CAIR. Good to have you here, everybody. Jeremy, you ventured into communities that you don't have a connection to, but you saw hate focused at them. What was that like?
I think for a lot of the experiences that individuals are going through in Muslim American communities all across the country, it's really difficult, and I think there's a lot of ire, and I think there's a lot of bigotry that's expressed at them in very ordinary places. You know, at the shopping market, at the stoplight, people are saying stuff, people are being attacked physically, and I think it's a really difficult time right now.
Deidre, this isn't just about Americans hating Muslims. This documentary is about the money behind it, the coordination, the talking points that are shared around. Was any of that a revelation for you?
I was already aware of this. I've been a Muslim walking around in society for years and an activist and attorney. So this is the reality that Muslims live, whether they decide to become high profile or not. What's most disappointing is there is an agenda, there's a lot of money behind it, and these very sincere people that are driven by fear are being used, and they don't even realize they're being used, and it's not even to their benefit.
So there was one person online who agreed that, not necessarily surprised, but this person says they were disgusted. This is a truth seeker on Twitter who says, I was disgusted to find out that Islamophobic organizations were funded in the millions by private organizations. All rhetoric and propaganda needs funding in order to thrive. It fits the U.S. agenda. More votes on the right, division, justify the war, and a Muslim ban. Jeremy, so he talks about this funding. You looked into donors who were funneling money and channeling money to some of these organizations. What surprised you the most?
I think one of the most difficult things to comprehend is the amount of dark money that's involved. And nowadays, especially post Citizens United decision about the involvement of money in U.S. politics, there's just a tremendous amount of funds that flow into these groups that's pretty much unchecked. You know, a lot of it we can verify who's giving it, and a lot of it we really can't, and that's very scary.
Want to explain what dark money is?
Yeah, basically there's organizations where you can funnel money into an organization For example, one of the ones that we feature is called, Donors Trust, which is in the documentary. They then funnel the money into Islamophobic organizations, and the original donor is shielded from being identified as the person who put the money into that organization to begin with.
Sure. I want to play a little clip for you. This is a gentleman called Reuben Israel. I use the phrase gentleman loosely. He's a street preacher. Have a look.
Here's an infidel right here. Here's an infidel right here. What are you going to do? We have banners and tools for every occasion. Here you have one of who Muhammad was and what their religion is about. My religion tells me that Islam is the bastard religion. Most people in America do believe Islam is bad, but don't want to say something. People? Yes.
According to what?
Well, we got a president that we put in office based on his on what he has to say about Islam.
Nazia, I didn't understand the level of hate I was seeing from individual Americans, but you're an anthropologist. Can you make more sense of it?
Sure. I teach about this Islamophobia industry in my classes at Stockton, and quite often, my students are stunned and shocked, as was the person who chimed in on Twitter, to hear about this well-funded network of Islamophobes. But, here we are on Memorial Day, and I think if we want to think about what the most well-funded anti-Muslim organization is, it's the one that invaded Iraq in 2003. And so my point is that we have to make these critical connections between the practices of the state itself. And by the state, I don't just mean the Trump administration, I mean what the US government has been doing for decades, if not longer, and how that kind of trickles down into the hearts and minds of individual bigots and these right-wing sort of fringe organizations. Because I think all too often we have this tendency to regard Islamophobia as this kind of freakish anomaly emanating from the far right, instead of something that's far more endemic to American race politics.
There's something that occurred to me, Ahmed, which was the talking points that circulate about how Muslims are, what they do, what they like. In your Twitter feed, pinned right at the top, tweet from Tommy Campbell, thinking every Muslim is a terrorist is like thinking every American is Donald Trump. But some of these talking points are very, very simplistic. Did you know where they came from? Do you know where they come from?
Well, we've seen the internet and the blogosphere sort of a breeding ground since about 10 years ago that starts some of the most pervasive narratives of Islamophobia in places where most people think they're going to remain niche, but they slowly branch out and get into the mainstream, first through the right-wing mainstream news networks and then into Main Street from there. But just to go back to what Nazia was saying, I agree with her 100%, and it didn't surprise me either. I've always talked about something called the Organized Islamophobia Network. You can call that the Islamophobia industry or Islamophobia Inc. or Fear Inc. But the notion that there's something agenda-driven and purposeful, it's not random, is important. Let me just say that there are two types of Islamophobia as far as I'm concerned. There's the political and the religious in one end, and then there's sort of the Main Street knee-jerk fear kind of reaction on the other. The first two are agenda-driven, whether it's religious or political. We'll get into the difference between the two. But they're also well-funded, and they're funded by billionaires and people who have power in society. People like Sheldon Adelson, the Mercer family, and some of the spokespersons are people in the Senate and in Congress.
Picking up on that point that, Ahmed, you're echoing Nazia's point, there's someone else online who would agree with both of you. H.G. Flores says Islamophobia was at an all-time high the first few years after 9/11. The election of Barack Obama helped alleviate U.S. Islam tensions, he says, unfortunately shifting the country back to racial fears. The campaign and the election of Trump is shifting those fears back into a post-9/11 phobia. So that's an interesting flowchart he's laid out for us. But someone online agreed with him in this tweet. Nisa says, I agree. It's easy for people to think, my president acts in this way, so it must mean that I can too. His abuse of Islam and Muslim people lends a cloak of legitimacy to perpetrators of violent attacks against Muslims. Nazia, I'm wondering what you think of this, since you brought up the fact that you see the government and a systemic source behind some of these attacks. What do you make of this comment?
Yeah, in my forthcoming book, I talk about how we need to think beyond Trump in this moment. And I think one of the really kind of tragic, one of the many tragic side effects of this new administration is that we're forgetting about the Islamophobias that came before. So, for instance, the fact that we have had in place a drone warfare program, intensified by Obama, that legally classified adult Muslim men as enemy combatants rather than as civilians. You know, and so we right now we run a risk of kind of resisting Trump only to reinstate the type of politics that brought us here in the first place. And I think one of the things we ought to be very diligent about in this moment is to think about the continuities, you know, the types of Islamophobia that have persisted regardless of party. You know, as Deepak Kumar says, Islamophobia is a bipartisan project. And I think we would be well served to sort of acknowledge it in that way.
Yes, Deidre.
A bigger problem is we saw after September 11th that a lot of elected leaders were disparaging Muslims. And what we saw after September 11th was a lot of elected leaders were actually pushing back and defending. We don't see that anymore. We see our elected leaders keeping their head down, even trying themselves to benefit from this rhetoric. And we need to raise the standard and the expectation. We've had people in the past who've stood up to their own detriment even to defend different marginalized communities, including Muslims. And we also have to realize that although this is a Muslim issue and we are getting a huge amount of negativity out of it, the people who are actually, by law, being hurt the most are actually the Latino community and the Black community. I mean, here in Arizona, we had SB 1070. So while people were disparaging Muslims, they were passing laws and trying to deport every brown person in Arizona and causing that negative reaction on the street, in the marketplace, for regular people who were brown in general. Not all Muslims can be identified, but all brown people can.
Jeremy, go ahead, Nazia, go ahead.
I think Deidre's point is absolutely critical because we're kind of stuck with this term, Islamophobia, and it's sort of a misnomer because this militarizing of our border and the ramping up of ICE, this whole creation of this concept of homeland security stemmed from a type of Islamophobic fear of a Muslim terrorist attack, but has ended up impacting Latino migrants in a large extent. And even the term Islamophobia itself assumes that the impacts of Islamophobia are uniformly felt, but they're certainly, you know, intensely felt in Black Muslim communities, in working class and undocumented Muslim communities. And if we're thinking about the Islamophobia industry, we can also think about the anti-Islamophobia industry and the ways in which so many of the voices that have been able to speak most vocally against Islamophobia have been often the most sheltered from Islamophobia's most devastating effects.
I hear.
One of the things I wanted to introduce is because we could speak about Islamophobia for days, but I'm really curious about hearing about how you then tackle it. What do you do about it? Jeremy, you did a very thorough job of pointing out the money, the talking points, the organization, the connections, that it's just not ordinary Americans hating, it's coordinated hate. Where is the fighting back in the documentary? Where does that come?
I like the dichotomy that Ahmed puts down because it begins in these think tanks, in these organizations, in these leaders, and emits down to sort of category B, which he was describing, which are people on the average street who are the ones who are the recipient of this message. And those are the people that I think need to be addressed. And those are the people that need to be having a conversation to understand that these talking points are not true. Sharia law is not coming to the United States, and it's not something that they need to fear.
Deidre, you're campaigning for the US Senate, and in a part of the documentary, you were having a meeting, and somebody was outside protesting. Here's that somebody.
Today, Deidre is in the town of Quartzsite in rural Arizona. Despite its remoteness, we still see the reach of Islamophobia incorporated.
What's all this about? We're protesting Deidre because she's a Muslim and she believes in Sharia law. Sharia law is against the Constitution.
They were concerned that Islamic law was already being enforced in the United States.
I care about when they try to supersede the law of the land, which is the Constitution.
Have you seen any evidence of that?
There's 4 towns that are currently under Muslim law, and Chicago might as well be.
Deirdre, when you're campaigning, you have to win those hearts and minds. And when there's so much Islamophobia out there, how are you tackling that? What do you do?
With humor and compassion and understanding that they are dealing with the best information they have, even though it's the worst information available. And you know, planting the seed that what they see before them is not what they assume. I mean, one of the things is, you know, people will say, you know, Muslims are trying to kill us. You know, their religion says that they're trying to kill us, or they have to kill us. And I'll say, okay, so you think that we're an alien species, that 1.8 billion people share a brain, and that even though 150,000 Muslims in Arizona are not trying to kill anybody, you still think that we're supposed to be doing that, even though we're not. Or the fact that on my campaign, one of my top 4 platform issues is separation of church and state. So when people come up to me and say, I don't want Sharia, I say, me either. Let's not have any religion in the government. Let's work together on that.
Jeremy, Sharia came up a lot in the documentary, and Sharia law, or pronounced in all sorts of ways I didn't realize it was able to be pronounced. Do people even know what it is?
The Sharia law is not even a thing, right? Yeah. So the idea that the industry takes a lot of words that sound foreign, that average Americans don't understand, and they attach a negative connotation to it, and that's what people take. I mean, we attended this march against Sharia that Act for America planned last year in 28 cities, and you had people out there with homemade signs screaming about Sharia. And, you know, at the heart of it was, you know, they were on the receiving end of this messaging that comes from the Islamophobia industry.
Femi, if I may interject, I've had a few interjections. Starting out backed up. Let me try to go through them. The first is when we speak about government, we cannot think of government as some entity that sits on its own. If we believe in a government of the people, by the people, for the people, when we speak of government, it's very crucial that we understand we speak of people. So who are the people in government? Who are the people that influence government? Who are the people that lobby and pay for the campaigns of those who are in government? That conversation is really what speaking of government ought to be about, because it's not a given and it's not inherent. It can change over time. It depends on who's influencing who. The second point is, when it comes to the street preachers, in a way, these are the least of my concern. They're a concern. They can be very dangerous. But they're pawns. If you think of the Islamophobia industry as sort of an army of chess pieces, they're the pawns. The ones behind that line of pawns are the ones whom we ought to be talking about as more dangerous. They often get a pass in the media. Nobody talks about the Mercer family as often and as intensely as we ought to, if we understood how influential and impactful they are on what the world is going through, not just the Muslim community in America. Likewise with the Sheldon Adelsons, second time mentioning those two family names. There's so many more, and the documentary touches that. Other books and reports and studies touch that, but it's not a narrative in mainstream American media yet, not by a long shot, and it needs to be.
And if I can follow up, so Ahmed's identifying some of the financiers behind the industry, but you also have to look at the people who are in government. You know, Jeff Sessions is the U.S. Attorney General. He's received awards from the Center for Security Policy. Mike Pompeo is the Secretary of State. He's received awards from Act for America. John Bolton is the National Security Advisor. He wrote the foreword for Pamela Geller's book. These individuals are very deeply connected with...
Pamela Geller, for anyone who hasn't seen the documentary yet, is a very important person in this
Yeah,
film.
she sort of came onto the scene in 2009 with the term Ground Zero Mosque. It's shameful that we even use it because that's not actually accurate, but that's really where she sort of, you know, took hold of television networks, and she was able to establish her message and establish her identity as sort of a leader in the Islamophobia movement. Sure. And that was a really key point in the history of this in the United States.
And those awards
you had Bannon before that, and you have Gaffney, and so on and so on.
So, and those awards you just mentioned, is that the equivalent of getting an award and getting praise from a hate group? Is that what you're saying?
The Southern Poverty Law Center identifies all of these as anti-Muslim hate groups. And yes, I mean, they receive an award. I mean, on the congressional side, if we're going to get into the politics more, a lot of these individuals represent very safe districts, and they're not afraid to associate themselves with fringe groups like Act for America. But yeah, they're receiving an award, and their connection.
They pick them up.
They're
There's one
there.
thing being awarded, another one picking it up and saying thank you so much.
I think for me, it's not. Their connections are so verifiable. It's a fact. They received this award. Mike Pompeo sponsored a Act for America legislation briefing on Capitol Hill. He sponsored the room for them so that they could meet. I mean, these are real ways in which they work with the industry and benefit from the industry.
When you hear about how systemic it is there, then I wonder what you all of our panel, makes of comments like this. This is Ali Buser, who talks about how to combat, how to tackle Islamophobia. She says the leading cause of Islamophobia is ignorance. If people spend the time to educate themselves about the Islamic culture, I believe we would see a significant change in negative stigma towards Islam and Muslims. So you see a lot of people advocating for educating and combating stereotypes. But then you have comments like this. This is Charlton Walker, who wrote into Al Jazeera saying, this is not Islamophobia, this is national security. Naz, what do you make of the juxtaposition of those two comments? Because you have people of many different camps in those two camps, really.
This is really the bulk of my work, which is trying to explore how so much of the effort to fight Islamophobia has centered on explaining who Muslims are to the West. You know, I teach these workshops, and everyone in the audience has heard the phrase, Islam is a religion of peace. And then no one has heard about material support for that the U.S. has provided in devastating the country of Yemen. And I think that, you know, in the documentary, there's this really provocative clip where a woman is saying, you know, Sharia law wants us to cut heads off of people. Well, if we want to talk about cutting heads off of people, we can talk about the cozy alliance between the U.S. and the Saudi government. And I think when you start to have these conversations about geopolitics, as opposed to understanding who Muslims are, you really start to begin to make some progress in debunking the very roots of Islamophobia.
That's right. You can't logic people out of a position that they weren't logicked into. So you can't try to convince them that the information they have is incorrect. You have to be able to address it in ways that they can understand, and just explaining to them that Muslims are nice and that, you know, we have some things in the Quran that can be taken out of context, just like you have stuff in the Bible that can be taken out of context. That doesn't resonate with people because they already believe that the Bible is correct or that the Bible is not correct, but they don't understand the relevance. So being able to take it to somewhere else that isn't about, it's not really about fact-based. It's about having human conversations. It's about having discourse. It's about not taking it personal so that you start becoming defensive and wanting to prove points that are so irrelevant to changing the dynamics that you've lost the battle.
Deirdre, there's a moment
also, it's important, again, to distinguish between the providers and the creators of the Islamophobic narratives, the wizards of Islamophobia, and the consumers of that content.
May I just play this clip? Because I think it sums up what you're all talking about yourself, and you've all got very impressive degrees and very impressive resumes. But what I feel it does come down to are everyday Americans who are struggling with the misinformation that's flying at them. So one of your constituents sat down with Simon, the correspondent for Islamophobia Inc., and he asked her this very important question. Have a listen.
Their agenda is to infiltrate, to get into politics, to get into churches, to get into schools.
But how do we get to a point where you're not suspicious of people like Deirdre, or you're not worried about Sharia in America?
How do I come to that point?
How do we get to the point where we're not worried about Sharia anymore?
Jeremy, that pause was so telling. I don't even know how long she needed to pause before she could come up with an answer. But for this film, for this documentary, could you tell when that point might be in American history?
I don't know. I mean, I think the clip is powerful because you can tell she's thinking about it, right? Yeah. This is not just some sort of knee-jerk thing that she's saying. She's put a lot of thought into it. Yeah. Obviously, her sources for her research are somewhat questionable, but it's something that gets at her inside, and she cares deeply about it. It's very evident on tape.
She's really trying to unpack it in her head. Deirdre, I know you want to say something, but I'm just about to wrap up. We're seconds away from the end of the show, but I wanted to check in with Malika. How's the conversation going down online?
Well, first of all, this from YouTube Live from Elizabeth, who says, Deirdre, I hope you win. We need intelligent people like you in government. But this is another that kind of sums up what we're discussing. Liza says the U.S. Muslim communities are doing all they can. It's up to the rest of us to stand up for them.
I have to say thank you to Deirdre and Nazia Ahmed in Germany for being with us. Let me just show you where you can see Islamophobia Inc. It is at aljazeera.com/investigation/Islamophobia Inc. And there you can watch it and then make your own decision. Thanks for watching, everybody. Malika and I will see you online. Take care.